Good evening and welcome to the other side of medicine. I'm Dr. Christosik. Glad that you're spending some time with us today. We are going to give a third presentation on Gut 911 tonight. And if you weren't here for the first two, don't worry about it because you can go to our Facebook group and that's at the other side of medicine. And you could get not only those two, but you could also get all the other podcasts that we've done over the past 6 months. So I encourage you, get a paper and a pen and get ready for a lot of information tonight on how to help the gut, how to create an environment in the gut for good health. That's what we're all about tonight. And so if you are suffering with gut problems, digestive problems, or if you have chronic disease, I'm sure what you're going to learn tonight will really make a huge difference for you. And you'll be able to apply these practical principles after you learn tonight. You'll be able to take all this information I'm providing and be able to use it on a daily basis in your lifestyle, your diet and your lifestyle. So let's talk a little bit about where we left off last week. Last week, we were talking about the early development, the first 3 years, the first 1,000 days of an infant's development, early childhood, and how that time period is so critical to the development of the microbiome, the bacteria living inside the gut. And if the child doesn't have the proper development of that gut integrity at that time, then it will carry on into their adult, life, and it will cause a lot of problems. There's been so many illnesses associated with imbalances in the gut bacteria, everything from autism, attention deficit disorder, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, so many of the mental conditions, as well as inflammatory bowel diseases, autoimmune diseases. And we've been talking about a lot of these things. We're going to dive into it deeper tonight and talk about why some of these things occur and how you can do something about it. So we talked last week, we left off about talking about how important a vaginal birth for an infant is, to be able to go through the mother's birth canal, to be able to get, I guess, quote, baptized with the mother's bacteria from getting a gulp, the baby getting a gulp of that bacteria, and getting seeded with the bacteria from the mother. And the bacteria that's beneficial, the bifidobacteria and the lactobacillus bacteria, provided by the mother's system, is so important because, as we talked about last week, if the child doesn't get that, then they're going to get the bacteria from the surface of the skin of the people who are present inside of the delivery room, as well as from the mother. So it's important to get that gulp of that bacteria from the mother. The other thing is that the maturation of the gut bacteria over time is so critical, starting at that first 3 years, setting that stage. If it's not properly seeded with the healthy bacteria at that time and it doesn't really get established, then autoimmune diseases, which are rampant today, will develop. And so we really need to make sure that we have the infants today are getting the proper development of that healthy bacteria. So a lot of studies have shown that we talked about last week, breast milk seeds the baby with healthy metabolites that come from the bacteria that are breaking down coming from the mother, as well as getting specific substances from the mother's milk, the oligosaccharides, which are the healthy prebiotics that the mother's milk provides for the baby are so important to make metabolites so that the bacteria can eat them, that oligosaccharides, and then make these healthy short chain fatty acids we talked about last week. And there is, inside of the mother's milk, there are peptides. There are little fragments of amino acids that are very, very potent, um, antigenic. They help to fight off bacteria. So they stimulate the immune system. So those peptides that the mother's milk provides are critical to the baby's well-being. So there's actually several studies in one specific study done in 7 different populations around the world. They found that infants that were exclusively breastfed, that these infants harbored much more diversity of bacteria, and they had much more stable microbiome than those children who were fed with formulas. And so they found that in the future, that these children, and as children, as teenagers, and as young adults, that the ones that got breastfed, they were able to handle carbohydrates better, to digest them, and to utilize the nutrients inside of carbohydrates better than the children who were formula fed. So it's very important to understand that the bacteria plays so many different roles in the helping to utilize nutrients in the food that we eat and so many other things. So we talked last week about how the signals are sent from the gut to the brain and the brain to the gut. And at that first 3 years with the baby's development, it's very critical to establish that good communication between the brain and the gut. And the vagus nerve as well, the nerve that comes out of the brain and goes right to the gut. Establishing that communication link early on is very important for the development of the child, as well as going to further into life. And then there's specific metabolites that I talked about earlier, these short chain fatty acids that are produced early on, that will go into the circulation and get transported throughout the entire body, affecting every organ and system of the body. So it's important that the first 3 years of development, of that maturation of those healthy bacteria inside the gut of the infant and the baby, is going to be critical for their well-being. So the metabolites that we talked about, if they're not manufactured, if all these things aren't set up properly, the regulation of the nervous system connected with the gut, if that doesn't happen, you're going to have things like ADD, attention deficit disorder. You can have things like autism and depression and anxiety and all the other cognitive impairments that occur when the baby doesn't have that proper development and maturation of the healthy bacteria inside the gut. The other thing is that during this critical time, there's what we call commensal microorganisms that are starting to thrive inside the baby. These are microorganisms that they're not harmful until there is a specific situation in the diet and lifestyle of the child, or the teenager, whoever it is. Those commensals are important because they help to produce different hormones, for example, like GABA, dopamine, neuroadrenaline, and other ones as well. Those hormones are produced by the various commensal microorganisms. Once again, these are not harmful. They're beneficial. They have their place, but they can also become a problem if there's the wrong environment inside the individual. So let's go back to our slide presentation and dive into continuation of what we did last week. Okay, so we're going to scoot on down. All right, and we're going to go right to this slide here, which was talking about the first 3 years that we just went over and reviewed a little bit right there. And then now we're going to move into how the diet and lifestyle affects the infant microbiota. We talked about this last week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just saying that the infant is really dependent upon the breast milk, as we talked about. Also, um, making sure that the the mother's conditions are healthy, so the mother's eating healthy and getting proper nutrition, and also um, making sure that the baby gets the vaginal birth. We talked about that, and then of course making sure that the baby gets seeded with the healthy bacteria from the mother and not from the bacteria on the skin of the medical workers. We don't want that to happen. So it's very important. Now, what I want to talk about right now is a little bit more in depth about the connection between the diet and the microbiome. There's a really strong connection. I'm going to kind of scoot on to a couple of slides here. This is the one I wanted right here. Yeah. So the connection between diet and the microbiome is profound. So when we look at Americans, the Western, we call this a Western diet. It's pretty despicable. I call it the standard American diet, abbreviated SAD. And so the average American is getting a lot of sugar. That's one of the things that they're getting, eating up to 150 pounds per year per adult. That's about 22 teaspoons of sugar per day. That's just a despicable amount of sugar that people are getting. And it's no wonder we have so many people with diabetes and prediabetes and obesity because we're getting so many of these dead calories. And so metabolic syndrome is on the rise. That's where you have elevated blood sugar, elevated blood pressure, and you also have the belly that's extended, the apple belly or the pear belly. These are common today, and this is a precursor to diabetes. And high cholesterol is another part of that, and high sugar levels. These are all part of what we call metabolic syndrome, and this is at epidemic levels here in this country. So we're getting not only the table sugar, we're getting these refined sugars like Splenda and aspartame and and all these other artificial sweeteners, and they're not any better. People think that they're better, but researchers at the University of California, Davis, have found that these artificial sweeteners increase people's appetite. So you eat and have a higher level of you don't get satisfied. You keep on wanting to go back for more food. So they found that the ghrelin levels, which is the hormone that the body releases when you're hungry, and that's released when you eat these artificial sweeteners. So you crave more food because the hormones are driving this insatiable desire for more food. You don't know why you keep on going back to the refrigerator, even though you just ate a meal, and then 20 minutes later you're standing in front of the refrigerator, scratching your head with the door open, trying to figure out why in the world are you standing there? You just ate. Well, it's because you're getting these artificial sweeteners, and the bad bacteria inside of you are just jumping for joy, and you're literally setting yourself up for disaster. So we need to understand that increased appetites come from an overpopulation of the bad bacteria and an imbalance of the hormones like ghrelin, which drives the hunger centers in the brain. So there's been a lot of studies with animals, specifically mouse studies, that show that high sugar diets develop the metabolic syndrome, which we talked about. And the United States Department of Agriculture found that not only the refined sugars, like the white sugar and artificial sweeteners, but also white rice and white flour, the standard flours and the standard rice that average person's eating, these refined grains, act just like sugar, just like cane sugar in the body, and they increase the risk for metabolic syndrome. So don't think, well, you're reducing the cane sugar or maybe other sweeteners, but you're still eating white flour and white rice. You're still getting the same kind of spiking of the sugar, and it's not going to be doing you any good. So I would stay away from those or minimize those things. So we know that when you eat these refined sugars and you have elevated levels of blood sugar, you increase the levels of pathogenic, harmful bacteria living inside the gut. You increase the risk for leaky gut, eroding the lining of the gut, and then ending up what we call the leaky gut, which we'll talk a little bit later about how that is devastating to the body, allowing harmful bacteria to get inside of the bloodstream. Not good. So the protective lining of the gut is affected because inflammation arises when you eat too much sugar. And then we end up with fatty liver disease, which is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is at epidemic levels today. And of course, it leads to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, strokes, and even cancers. So the bad bacteria, they thrive on refined sugar. That's what they need for energy. Good bacteria prefer prebiotics. These are non-digestible carbohydrates. We've talked about them before. Fiber, water-soluble and water-insoluble fibers. So we'll over the period of time that we talk about this course, we'll dive into the difference between those fibers more than one time. So they've shown that in studies, family members that eat the same, they can eat the same, but their blood sugar will spike differently. And why is that? Well, the researchers have found it depends upon the type of bacteria living inside of the gut of each individual. So if one person has healthy bacteria, then they're going to be able to keep their blood sugar levels at a nice even keel. When the ones who have the imbalance, where they have improper and unhealthy bacteria living there, they're going to have greater spikes in blood sugar, and then that's going to cause insulin resistance over time, and they're going to end up with diabetes. So the bacteria plays a vital role in all those things. So, and again, people eat the same foods, but they react differently because of the bacteria. So they also found that epigenetics plays a key role. The people who have a predilection towards, let's say, diabetes, when they have the wrong type of bacteria living inside their gut, it triggers that weakness that they have in their genetic pool to become alive. And then it shows up as diabetes or whatever other kind of problem that could develop because of the susceptibility that they have as far as their genetic weaknesses. So we need to recognize that minimizing the refined sugars and the refined carbohydrates is critical to keeping inflammation down, reducing the growth of the bad bacteria, and then keeping our body weight at normal levels. And of course, when we do all these things, we reduce our risk for infections. We keep our moods at a more even keel, so we don't have anxiety or depression. All these things are linked to our dietary patterns. So on this slide, let's look at this right here. Now, the Western diet, or the standard American diet, as you can see on this chart, it really triggers a lot of imbalances inside the gut. As a result, we end up having problems with the opportunistic microorganism. These opportunistic microorganisms, they're living inside of our gut and they're waiting for the opportunity to create trouble. Normally, they're kept in check by the good bacteria, but if there's an imbalance and we're not eating the right foods, then these opportunistic microorganisms, which can cause harm, raise their ugly heads. And when we eat the Western diet, we're inviting these opportunistic microorganisms to flourish and to spread their toxic elements throughout the entire body. So we also have increased levels of lipopolysaccharides, which are metabolites that the bad bacteria spit out. This is waste matter from the bad bacteria, and the Western diet, again, it encourages the growth of the bad bacteria, which then in turn makes these harmful metabolites. Remember, the good bacteria, the beneficial bacteria, manufacture healthy metabolites, healthy compounds, but not the bad bacteria. They're spitting out these lipopolysaccharides, and I might next week talk about how damaging these lipopolysaccharides are, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on that because they're quite harmful. And then the beneficial short chain fatty acids that are reduced in quantity because of the overabundance of the harmful bacteria. And then again, if we're eating a healthy plant-based diet, just the opposite happens. We have a decreased levels of opportunistic microorganisms. They're kept in check. And then we have lower levels of the lipopolysaccharides, or none at all, or very little, if any. And then we have the healthy bacteria and short chain fatty acids are produced in abundance. So this is how nature intended for us to live off this plant-based diet. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be a vegetarian, although I think that that's a healthy diet, extremely healthy diet. And, you know, if you can go that way, then all the power to you. It would be absolutely wonderful. But if you decide that you want to eat some animal protein, I would stay closer to eating fish, and then maybe occasionally have some chicken, and then save things like beef for special occasions. This is what the healthiest populations on the planet do. They eat minimal amounts of animal protein or none at all, and they have the healthiest microbiome, and their balance inside of their gut is just absolutely stellar, and it really provides a shield against disease. So once again, we have to recognize that there are over 200 different species of microorganisms that live inside the gut. And the more diverse that we have of these variety of different bacteria, the healthier we're going to be. Inside of the healthy person that eats a plant-based diet, we find that they have a lot of the bacteria that are called bifidobacteria and lactobacillus and Akkermansia. You might have heard me talk about some of these things, as well as heard from other people talk about them as well. These beneficial bacteria help to fight off bad bacteria. They keep them in check. Akkermansia is one that, as we talked about in the past, helps to produce the mucus lining, the barrier on the gut, so that you don't have harmful microorganisms entering into the bloodstream. And of course, we know that Akkermansia is at higher levels in people who are thin, and they're at lower levels who are people who are overweight. So we want to encourage these beneficial bacteria. They have healthy outcomes. We know that these harmful microorganisms they're in a particular class called Bacteroides, and there are specific strains like Ruminococcus, which are associated with unhealthy outcomes. So we'll talk more about that. But these are all healthy and unhealthy microorganisms that live inside of our gut. We want to, again, have a balance and have about 80% of healthy. We're going to have some opportunistic, which may not at all times behave well unless you get sick, unless you're eating bad foods. They can raise their ugly head and cause problems. But we want primarily to have 80% of the lactobacillus and the acidophilus and the Akkermansia and the bifidobacteria and those beneficial ones. That's what we want. So let's look at what happens when we have various, colonies. That's what we would talk about, colonies of these microorganisms. And scientists look at these various patterns of how these develop inside of the gut. So there's various different types of patterns that we find in different populations of people, in healthy people and sick people and people who are, immunocompromised. And so basically they found that there's 3 different patterns or 3 different types. They call them enterotypes. And the first type, we find that there is a higher level of these Bacteroides, which I mentioned to you is got a negative health outcome. And when you're eating a Western diet, like we talked about earlier, that's high in saturated fat, that's high in sugar, that's high in refined carbohydrates, you have these various types of microorganisms like proteobacteria and Provotella. These are harmful. They're what we call gram-negative bacteria, and these gram-negative bacteria, they feed on waste products. And they also feed on saturated fat and alcohol and sugar. So these are the harmful microorganisms. They thrive and survive on these foods that Americans are eating a lot of sugar, a lot of saturated fat, and they're drinking, of course, abundance of alcohol, many people, and they create an environment where it damages the lining of the gut, causes inflammation, and then, of course, leads to the leaky gut. And then there's a lot of trouble that occurs after that. We'll talk more about that later. But the second type of enterotype, the second type of pattern, is a pattern where we have a high level of the plant-based diet, and in these individuals, there's lower levels of Bacteroides. So the Bacteroides bacteria are lower inside of the individuals who are eating a plant-based diet. Now, earlier I said the Provotella is increased in the person who's got harmful bacteria. Actually, the Provotella is a more healthy outcome. So I apologize for that. The Provotella provides healthy outcomes as well as the other healthy bacteria that I mentioned earlier. So the third type is higher in what we talked about earlier, the Ruminococcus, and this is associated with inflammatory diseases like irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And this comes from eating fewer plant foods, having less diversity of good bacteria, eating more refined sugars, more saturated fat, and a lot of things like the alcohols and the alcohol sugars and all that other stuff that triggers this harmful bacteria to grow. So diet plays a vital role in the development and the maturation of beneficial bacteria as well as harmful bacteria. So you want your body to be a primarily plant-based machine, and you want to minimize the refined carbohydrates, the animal proteins, the sodas, the sweet drinks, the sugary candies, and all that stuff that the Americans thrive on is just a breeding ground for these harmful microorganisms. So we have a great deal of control over what kind of bacteria living inside of our gut. So, and this is really an interesting point, because if you eat good food, but you've got bad bugs living in you, you're going to end up having a lot of symptoms. So sometimes people will switch and start to try to eat healthy foods, and yet they'll feel terrible because they have a lot of bad bugs living inside of them. They have an imbalance of the good and the bad bacteria. They try to switch to healthy diet and they feel worse. And they think to themselves, well, I'm not getting better. I'm feeling worse eating healthy. I'm not going to do this. And so they stop. And the doctor doesn't know anything about that. And they're kind of scratch their head. Well, there's a reason for it. If you've got bad bugs and you put in good food, there's going to be a war, and there's going to be a lot of collateral damage, and you're going to have bloating and gas, and you're going to feel fatigued and all kinds of other things. So you have to really be aware of that. You have to get rid of the bad bugs and then start to eat the healthy foods once you get rid of the harmful microorganisms. Very important point. So we're going to be talking more detail about this. I'm going to spend a whole evening just talking about the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Remember, inside of the intestines, of the small intestines, you should have very little to no bacteria living there. And when it has an overpopulation of microorganisms living there, then you start to have a lot of symptoms. You could have depression, anxiety, fatigue, bloating, gas, irritability, the symptoms. You can have autoimmune disease. You can just go on and on. So many different kinds of conditions that can evolve and develop because of the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So we want to make sure that we are recognizing that we could have an imbalance inside of our bacteria, inside of our gut, and we have to take the right measures, and there is a proper sequence to take care of this. And as we get farther into this course, I'm going to talk about that so that you can reestablish a healthy integrity of the gut bacteria, having more good and just a little bit of the bad, or a little bit of the opportunistic living there, so it keeps it all in balance. So this is the leaky gut. I'm going to talk more about this, but this is a good time maybe to kind of delve into the leaky gut a little bit, because the leaky gut is a phenomenon that so many people walking around with chronic diseases today have this phenomena occurring in their body, and they have no clue what's going on. It's called leaky gut, or increased intestinal permeability is the medical term. So if you would go on the internet and do research and say increased intestinal permeability, there'll be all kinds of research studies that come up that talk about this phenomenon, and it's a layman's term called leaky gut. But what is happening is the lining of the gut, we've talked about this early on, has one cell layer thick. Remember, there's a mucus layer that protects the layer of cells, that one layer of cells. And if that mucus layer gets irritated or damaged, then those cells could start to erode. And then you could have this problem where the junctions, these tight junctions, if you look here on this slide here, these junctions here are supposed to be tight, and they only open up during time of absorption normally. But if they open up at other times and they keep open all the time, then you're going to allow things to get through this gut barrier that shouldn't be there, like undigested particles of food. You can let things like bacteria. Remember, when we talk about bacteria, it could be fungus or yeast or parasites, or it could be protozoa, or it could be archaea, it could be fungi, it could be any number of different microorganisms we're just calling bacteria, can get into the bloodstream, and then it circulates. Also, remember I talked about those metabolites that the bad bacteria manufacture, the lipopolysaccharides. Those could start leaking into the bloodstream, and now you've got a toxic bloodstream that is triggering the immune system with autoimmune reactions and inflammatory reactions, and triggering all kinds of symptoms. And the doctors are treating these symptoms with medications, and if it gets worse, they treat it with surgery. This is not the way to get to the root cause. You need to repair this lining of the gut. Once the gut lining is repaired, then you can reestablish the healthy microbiome, the healthy bacteria balance, and then things will start to work like normal again. But if you don't correct this scenario here, if you don't correct this pathology, this problem, you're only going to be putting band-aids on the problems and treating symptoms and not getting the true underlying cause. We're going to talk more about this leaky gut, but for now, to suffice to say, this is very problematic and it's very common. And people are walking around what I call the walking wounded, and they're not getting any relief. And they start off by having symptoms that are being treated with over-the-counter and even prescription medications. And eventually, if it's untreated and not corrected, it turns into disease, and then it becomes chronic, and then people are in now the medical gerbil wheel. They're stuck, never going to get out. They're just staying there. So we want you to be free from that. That's why we're teaching you about this. So it's really important to remember this is all happening at a microscopic level. These particles that we're seeing that entering the bloodstream, they're still microscopic, but they're larger than normal sizes that should enter into the bloodstream. And so consequently, it triggers red flags and the immune system is alerted, and we have a 911 situation in the gut. And again, medicine is coming to the rescue with toxic drugs and surgery and not getting to the cause. So stress and inflammation is something that we're going to talk about. But before we do, I want to kind of back up here, and I want to look at something I think is very important. Kind of missed this here. This slide is very important because it really demonstrates the indigenous tribes of these various countries that are living a simple lifestyle, which we have gotten away from, is very important because they are eating what comes from the earth. If you see what's on that fire, those are sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are one of the best and healthiest prebiotic foods that the bacteria, the beneficial bacteria, absolutely love. And these people are cooking these sweet potatoes on an open fire, and they're sitting on the ground, and their feet and their hands are touching the soil, and they're getting inoculated with healthy microorganisms from their environment. You see, there's a theory called the hygiene theory of disease, which we have become so enamored by a meticulous, clean environment that we've gone to such extreme that we've excluded, by using all these antibacterial soaps and cleaners and chemical agents, that we've killed off a lot of these microorganisms that we as humans should be exposed to, like they are in nature, and their immune system is stronger because of it. And this hygiene theory of disease says we become so enamored by trying to be so bug free that we have established a situation where our skin and our gut has become lacking of these beneficial bacteria that we find in the soil and in the food that sometimes comes in, microorganisms come in on the food. So once again, this hygiene theory of disease says that, for example, children, when I was growing up, we would play in the dirt, and oftentimes dirt would end up in our mouth. And sometimes we'd even swallow a little bit. And our parents didn't freak out. We would just tell us, well, go wash your hands and take care of yourself. But now, today, the parents almost rush their children to the doctor or the hospital because they swallowed some dirt. It's not bad. It's actually a good thing to help our immune system. I'm not telling you to go out and just eat some dirt, but you shouldn't be so dramatic about trying to be so clean that you miss out on what these natives are getting out in nature. And that's what the natural environment provides us. And this hygiene theory of disease says these people are of a much stronger immune system who live close to nature than we do, because they're exposing themselves to microorganisms inside and outside of their bodies. So this is a very important point that we shouldn't overlook. And they also are eating a diverse plant-based diet. A lot of these plants that you see around them, they're probably eating some of those plants and these herbs in their environment. And their gut bacteria is very diverse. And it's actually, they have found and studied these various indigenous tribes, whether they're in Africa or in South America or in the Himalayan mountains or wherever. People live close to the land in the Mediterranean. They live in the rural areas. And they have found that these people have such a diverse diet that on average they're getting 150 to 250 different plant-based foods in a given couple-week period. So the more plants that you have, the more diverse plants that you're eating, you're consuming, the more diverse your gut bacteria is going to be. And that's what these scientists have found, that these people that are living close to the land, eating a wide variety of plant-based foods, they have a tremendous variety of different types of microorganisms living inside their gut, and they're healthier. So what I'd like you to do over the next week is to do a little exercise. And I would like to have you over the next week count how many different plant foods. I'm talking about fruits, vegetables, herbs, nuts, seeds, grains, beans, all different types of plant-based foods. How many different ones are you eating in a week? So log in every time you have a different one, or if you eat a meal and you got 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, just write them all down and let's count how many of different plants that you get over the next week, varieties of plants. And let's see how diverse your diet is as an exercise. Okay, and then you could actually leave a comment next week inside of Facebook, my Facebook group, or The Other Side of Medicine, or Dr. Christosa, wherever you're listening to this on YouTube. You can leave a comment and let me know how many different types of plants that you ate over the last week. It'd be fun to see what people are doing. Okay, so, oh, by the way, I want to make a little side note here, because I know a lot of people have kind of migrated to uh, using stevia, which is a plant-based sweetener. And now there's some research coming out and showing that stevia actually, again, this is preliminary, and I don't want to rush into this by giving you false information, but I'm just seeing some data is saying that stevia can cause increased appetite, just like these artificial sweeteners, and cause weight gain and cause some other adverse effects like headaches in some people, very few, but some, and behavioral and cognitive dysfunction, neurological dysfunctions. So let's continue to watch on the stevia. Oh, and by the way, I'm thinking that the reason it is because stevia today is being so refined. In other words, the manufacturers of stevia are making it so pure, it's almost becoming like an adulterated plant food because the way they manufacture it, and they're having compounds that are inside of it that I think are triggering some of these problems. So let's keep an eye on that and just be aware of where you're getting the stevia and getting it minimally processed. And I'll keep you posted and tell you what I find out in the future as well. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit about that. So let's move on. And I want to go to the next slide down here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about inflammation and some of the behavioral disorders that are triggered from eating the standard American diet, the SAD diet. So we know that when we're eating healthy plant-based foods primarily, we're seeing a good connection between the gut and the brain. So that two-way highway is working really well. And we're seeing that there's normal function that's going on inside of the gut where there's no leaky gut. There's, again, the inflammation is curbed, and we have good absorption of nutrients, and the symptoms that we have are not being triggered by things like stress. Stress is something that really aggravates the balance of the good and bad bacteria. The research is clear. Stress, emotional and physical stress, can trigger an imbalance of the good and bad bacteria. Very important to understand that when we are healthy and we're managing the stress, because we're all going to be exposed to stress, especially in our Western society, we're going to be exposed to it. But the way that we deal with stress and the way we respond to stress is going to make all the difference in the world. But the point being is that stress triggers inflammation, which leads to alterations in the gut bacteria, which leads to changes in behavior and our ability to focus, our ability to think properly, cognition, and all of our senses and awarenesses are disrupted because of the stress that's causing us to be in a fight or flight situation, which then makes the bacteria in our gut jump for joy. The harmful bacteria, that is, they begin to flourish when these stress hormones are released. And so we've got to be aware that stress triggers the harmful bacteria to proliferate. And so we need to understand that there's a connection between the inflammatory response that is elicited during times of stress, and then the triggering of the production of unhealthy bacteria. So once again, we need to find ways to to diminish and to resolve the stressors in our life. Now, we can't get away from stress. We've got stress at home, we got stress in our jobs, we got stress in our relationships. Stress is everywhere, but the way we respond to it is going to be the critical factor. And so I would like to encourage you to go to my YouTube channel and learn about some techniques to be able to thwart the negative effects of stress by doing deep breathing. I have a 3-part series on deep breathing that can make a huge difference in how you deal with stress every single day. And by doing these exercises that I provide in this 3-part series, you will provide a shield against the stressors that we all have in our life, that we're all exposed to, that we're all experiencing throughout the day. And if you start to apply the principles that I talk about in this 3-part series, I believe you're going to see a dramatic shift in how stress affects you in your life. Well, my friends, we've run out of time again tonight, but next week we'll be back with part 4 of the Gut 911, and we'll continue to talk about how the gut microbiome affects our weight, either weight gain or weight loss. We'll talk about how it affects our cardiovascular system and much, much more. So if this has been informative, I'd like to have you leave a comment for me in the comment section wherever you're listening, and tell your family and friends about us. But until next week, I'm Dr. Christosik, and I encourage you to tell other people about this podcast. And I'm on YouTube, I'm on Facebook, and you can subscribe to our channels, subscribe to our Facebook group at The Other Side of Medicine, and we'll keep you posted on a lot of the guests that we'll have coming up in the near future after we're finished with the Gut 911 series, which I think will be in a couple weeks. And then we'll continue on having some nationally and internationally known guests. So until then, may God bless you, and ciao for now.